So this presentation is titled Motherhood, Womanhood, Grief, and Art, an exploration of healing from the loss of a child you may never have. How does one rationalize something they already knew? How can an artwork express an inexpressible isolation from womanhood as a concept? How can a trans woman assert her womanhood to herself? Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Eisen. I'm a Zambian-American printmaker and trans woman living in Wheeling, West Virginia. And throughout my work, I explore the nature of queerness, trans-feminine issues relating to womanhood, the human body as it exists throughout gender permutations, and the racial diaspora of living in America. My work relating to womanhood is often quite challenging and tackles the disconnect between trans and cisgendered women. However, in the case of this work, I Think I'll Miss You, it's in that disconnect that we find a commonality between us. I Think I'll Miss You takes the form of an oversized baby blanket, sized at just over 60 inches, created out of various scrapped artworks that I've created throughout different points in my transition. This work was intended to be draped around me. In the center of the work, we see one of the most famous Christian icons of all time, the Madonna and Child, the quintessential image of motherhood as a concept. Tape is used to disconnect Mary from Jesus to further reinforce this idea of a physical disconnect from motherhood, a literal and metaphorical barrier representing my own infertility resulting from gender-affirming hormone therapy. Throughout the work, a trailing umbilical cord can be seen to the left of Jesus. This too is spatially disconnected from Mary. It should be noted that the repeated motif of open graphic eyes do not hold an entirely negative connotation despite their initially sinister appearance. This symbol, along with a few others, reappear throughout most of my artwork as a nod to their historical and cultural significance throughout art history, and in this context, they represent a watchfulness. Not necessarily of others, but of oneself. These eyes are reflexive, viewing and analyzing the scene not unlike an audience. These eyes are witnessing a separation, not only of a mother and her child, be them real or symbolic, but of a woman, but of womanhood and motherhood, and how this work compartmentalizes the two concepts. Despite my own secularity, since transitioning, I've always been drawn to Mary beyond her religious context, viewing her as a sort of deification of womanhood as a concept, drawing from the Catholic veneration of Mary, more so than seeing her as the mother of Christ. Throughout many cultures, especially my own, womanhood is hallmarked by motherhood. They are largely inseparable concepts that are intrinsically linked. This, obviously, is incredibly disheartening as a wombless woman, who is, despite this fact, as well as her own disinterest in child rearing, still pressured into performative motherhood. The idea of at least considering all of my options in some attempt to put on some semblance of motherhood. This artwork is less so a yearning for motherhood in order to validate my own and others' womanhood, but rather shows the thought process of somebody accepting this fact and grieving accordingly with all the intentions of healing. I Think I'll Miss You reinterprets the image of Mary into a new icon, an icon representing an assertion of womanhood, removed from the context of motherhood and brought into her own specific frame. My top priority with I Think I'll Miss You was to incorporate language as an artistic element throughout the work. I did so through the use of one word. That word being think. This uncertainty. If I were to decide on a central theme for this artwork, it would be the uncertainty with which women, cis and trans, operate as women. Womanhood, for many, and not all, is a series of validation exercises with the aim of fulfilling some societal expectation of performative gender, with motherhood mentioned earlier being no exception. Think really demonstrates my and many others' uncertainty and unease with these expectations. I think I don't want a child. I think that I'm still a woman without a child. I think that I won't regret having a child. Think is a really powerful word because it brings to surface the doubts with which we process our own decisions and how we address those doubts. What an absurd concept when you really think of it. A baby blanket made out of protest of childlessness. Infertility is, especially at my age, such a challenging topic for many people. I began transitioning last year fully knowing that this would be an inevitability, that I would not be able to be a mother. I never really had that much interest in parenthood prior, but the inability to really struck a chord with me. It was in this denial of a life milestone that I truly reconciled with the concept. I Think I'll Miss You was an incredibly painful piece to make, and I'm already cracking up just thinking about it. I assure you that my tears are soaked into those pages. But ultimately, this is in my mind one of the most important artworks I could ever make throughout my entire career. Transgender women are often sequestered into their own spaces and largely disconnected from women. My goal as an artist is to close that distance and bring to the front the fact that transgender women suffer with the same concepts and issues as cis women, and that we are just as powerless to solve them. Ultimately, I think I'll Miss You was when I really started thinking that I was a woman. I would really like to thank you for the chance to present and discuss this artwork with all of you. I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me as a trans woman, being this sort of invisible person and not really having much of a voice or societal power to express these feelings. This is, for me, an incredibly wonderful way to kind of end my undergraduate college career. So I really thank you. I have the artwork in full frame on screen right now. If anybody has any questions regarding the artwork and its themes, by all means, I'd be more than happy to ask them. Or answer them, sorry.
Thank you. So I'm curious about a little bit about your actual creation of the artwork. So I guess I didn't pick up, and it's based on a baby blanket, right? That was
Yes.
the base of the artwork?
So the general shape and prompt that inspired this work was function, and the function of artwork, exploring that through the single word prompt being blanket. And it made me think less so of like a comforter. When we use the word blanket, it never really refers to an adult object. I, in my personal experiences, don't really associate the word blanket with adult contexts, and mainly I think of a baby blanket. And so I was immediately drawn to that, as at the same time I may have been preoccupied with this real lingering self-doubt towards and regarding my own womanhood, and a lot of invasive questions from my father, who is Zambian, and his family regarding my prospects of having children. I know when I finally had the courage to tell them, the first thing I was asked was if I was going to inevitably be sterilized, and the answer is, for a lot of people, yes, including myself. So it was a really intrusive line of questioning. It was a really intrusive thing to ask me, especially at such a vulnerable time. So it just really stuck in my mind, and I wanted to recontextualize that baby blanket to almost comfort myself and process through that.
One of the things that I find to be really interesting about this, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about more, Michelle, is this idea of I'm seeing pieces, different pieces of things put together into a whole, right? And they're taped together, they're, they're pieced together, they're layered. And so how does that, and I'm also seeing kind of a color scheme of kind of red, yellow, and blue, which is a really important triad. And so could you talk a little bit about how you either selected these pieces or how you chose to put them in specific places? You did explain the Madonna and Child, but what about some of these other interesting pieces I'm seeing?
So the actual physical materials that this blanket are made of are scrapped artworks that all sort of follow the process color themes of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. However, I don't really work with magenta or cyan. I tend to go with a more of a cerulean blue, like a very light blue, and process red usually. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my work is in that color scheme. Less so black being a significant color of the scheme and more so just an accenting mark. The three predominant colors, that yellow, red, and blue, really, it made me think more of a trinity, alluding further to that secular Christian, I know how just crazy that sounds, element of the work. The work I selected were all pieces of art that were failed. It was a process of selecting failure. It was a very interesting curatory process, is just going through and re-examining failure.
And so when you say they're scrapped pieces of artwork, they're actually your original
Yeah, no,
artwork.
this is all old pieces of work that I've made.
Okay.
And to tie that into a failure of a reproductive system, I wanted to breathe life into this, breathe some form of vitality into this failure, these essentially dead works. These aren't artwork that are going to make it, these aren't pieces of art that are going to make it into a portfolio, or I don't really care for. I realized that I lack a nurturing, or a sense of nurturing, and more recently it has been developing, so I really became attached to these failures almost as an extension of myself, similarly to how children are an extension of their parents.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're fine. I was about to say thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for coming and sharing your artwork with us. I really appreciate that. And it's really wonderful to hear about your creative process behind that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so